On any given night, 35,574 American veterans have no place to call home. This is about one who gave away his last source of warmth. On a freezing Christmas Eve, a homeless man with PTSD handed his only blanket to a shivering child at a bus stop. He expected nothing in return. He couldn't have known that shivering boy would one day command a fleet of private helicopters and turn them all toward a single mission: finding the veteran who saved him. The veteran was Marcus Thorne, a former Army sergeant whose battles didn't end in the desert. The child was Leo Johnson, shivering not just from the cold, but from a life that had already shown him too much hardship. Their brief exchange lasted less than a minute. So why, a decade later, would that single act compel a billionaire to scour the city? And what hidden connection made finding Marcus a matter of life and death? Marcus Thorne's descent began not on the streets, but 7,000 miles away, in the dust of Kandahar province. A sergeant with the 101st Airborne, he completed 2 tours, earning a commendation for pulling 3 members of his squad from a burning vehicle after an IED strike. He came home to Ohio in 2011 with all his limbs, but not all of his mind. The diagnosis was severe post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded by a traumatic brain injury from that same blast. The Veterans Administration approved his benefits, but the process was a labyrinth of paperwork and waiting. He found temporary work as a security guard, but the night shifts with their sudden noises became unbearable. The nightmares kept him from sleeping in a room with walls. He began sleeping in his car then, when the car was repossessed, on a friend's couch. When his patience and his friend's goodwill ran out, the couch became a bench in Riverside Park. That was 18 months before that Christmas Eve. His world had narrowed to the contents of a weathered backpack and the search for the next meal. He avoided the crowded shelters, the noise, and chaos there threatening to undo the fragile peace he fought for daily. The olive-green army jacket was his only uniform now, its patch from the Screaming Eagles faded but still visible. He survived on the kindness of a soup kitchen run by a local church and the small disability check that arrived each month, most of which went to repaying old debts. He was a ghost to his former life, but he was, in his own quiet way, still standing. His most prized possession was a thick gray wool blanket donated by the church. It was his shelter, his bed, his only reliable defense against the brutal Ohio winters. But that night, his own survival wasn't what concerned him. He was watching a small figure under the flickering streetlight at the bus stop on the corner of Elm and 3rd. 6-year-old Leo Johnson was supposed to be waiting for his mother. She was working a double shift as a home health aide across town, and her sister, Leo's Aunt Marla, was supposed to pick him up from after-school care. A text message never arrived, a phone battery died, a misunderstanding snowballed. By the time Leo realized no one was coming, the daycare was locked and the winter dark had settled in. He knew the bus number that went near their apartment. He didn't have a fare. He stood at the stop, hoping a familiar face would appear, his thin jacket zipped to his chin, his small body trembling not just from the cold, but from a fear he was too young to fully articulate. He watched the buses come and go, their doors hissing open, warm air wafting out like a taunt, then closing again. He'd been there for 45 minutes. The cold wasn't just weather. It was a presence, seeping through his sneakers, needling his cheeks, making his teeth chatter in a rhythm he couldn't control. From his bench across the small park, Marcus watched. He saw the boy's anxious glances down the empty street, the way he hopped from foot to foot, the visible plumes of his breath coming faster and shallower. He saw a child alone, and in the military, you never leave a man behind. The instinct was older than his homelessness, deeper than his trauma. He stood up, his joints protesting the cold, and walked across the frozen grass. Leo saw the man approaching, tall, bearded, wearing a soldier's jacket. He took a small step back, eyes wide. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away. He crouched slowly, wincing as his knees cracked, putting himself at eye level. "You waiting for someone, soldier?" he asked, his voice gravelly but calm. Leo nodded, unable to speak. "Bus isn't coming for that route for another hour," Marcus said gently. He'd memorized the schedules long ago. You'll freeze." Leo just hugged himself tighter, a single tear cutting a path through the dirt on his cheek, immediately turning cold. Marcus didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his backpack, unclipped the roll from the top. He shook out the thick gray blanket. It was worn at the edges, but it was clean and it was warm. He stood and stepped forward, not touching the boy, just draping the blanket around his small shoulders, tucking the ends in. The wool was heavy, almost swallowing him. "There," Marcus said, his own breath a cloud in the air between them. "Now you hold the line until your reinforcements arrive. Understood?" Leo, buried in sudden, profound warmth, looked up at him. He managed another nod, his chattering slowly subsiding. Marcus gave him a firm, slow nod in return, a sergeant to a young recruit. Then he turned, picked up his now much lighter backpack, and walked away into the shadows between the streetlights, disappearing into the December night without looking back. Leo watched him go, confused, grateful, and profoundly warm. 20 minutes later, a frantic Aunt Marla screeched to a halt in her hatchback, apologies pouring out. She bundled Leo and the strange, wonderful blanket into the car, cranking the heat. "Where did you get this, baby?" she asked, rubbing his arms. "A soldier gave it to me," Leo said, his voice muffled by the wool. It became his blanket. For years, through moves and hardships, he slept with it. He called it his armor. He didn't know the soldier's name. He only remembered the tired blue eyes and the faded eagle on the jacket. For Marcus Thorne, the consequences were immediate. That night was the coldest of the season. Without his blanket, he spent it walking tirelessly to keep his blood moving, seeking refuge in a 24-hour laundromat, shivering in a corner. A chest cold took root, turning into bronchitis. He became weaker, more isolated. Within weeks, he stopped appearing at his usual spots. The church volunteers wondered. Then they worried. Then they assumed the worst. Marcus Thorne, the quiet veteran who always said thank you, had vanished from the streets of Columbus. He didn't die. He simply disappeared into the vast, anonymous network of crisis and survival that exists below the sightline of most of the world. He was in a different city, in a different state, fighting a different, more invisible battle. The blanket was gone, and with it, the last thread connecting Sergeant Marcus Thorne to the world that remembered him. While Marcus faded into the margins of America, the boy he wrapped in wool was on a trajectory that would defy every statistic stacked against him. Leo Johnson never forgot the cold, not the physical chill of that bus stop, but the deeper cold of being forgotten, of being invisible. The blanket was a tangible proof that a stranger could see you, could choose to help. It became his psychological bedrock. Life didn't get easier immediately. His mother, Cynthia, worked brutal hours for little pay. They moved between apartments, sometimes staying with relatives. But Leo had a fierce, quiet focus. He was obsessed with systems, with efficiency, with solving puzzles. While other kids played video games, he taught himself to code from library computers, building little programs to organize his mother's billing or optimize his homework schedule. He saw problems as equations waiting to be balanced. The chaos of poverty was a problem he was determined to solve. He kept the blanket folded at the foot of his bed. When the anxiety of an unstable world crept in, he would touch the coarse wool. It was a reminder: warmth existed, kindness existed, a solution existed. His break came in high school. He entered a national STEM competition with a project born from his own life, a mesh network app for resource-poor communities to share real-time alerts about food pantry hours, free clinic availability, and warming shelter locations. It was a digital version of the street-level knowledge Marcus had used to survive. He called it Common Thread. It won. A full-ride scholarship to Stanford followed. At Stanford, Leo was a ghost of his former nervous self. He was driven, intense, and brilliantly intuitive. He saw the sprawling, inefficient mess of urban social services not as a charitable cause, but as the world's most critical logistics problem. In his sophomore year, he partnered with a philosophy major named Anya Chen. Together, they theorized that the biggest barrier to helping people wasn't a lack of resources, but but a catastrophic failure of information flow. Philanthropy was pouring water into a leaking bucket. Their senior thesis proposed a platform, a dynamic, AI-powered resource mapping and routing engine for cities. They called it Loom. Its logo was a simple, stylized weave of threads. Venture capitalists, always hungry for the next big thing with a social impact angle, threw money at them. Loom's initial test in San Francisco showed a 40% increase in the utilization of underused services and a significant drop in crisis calls. Cities began licensing the platform. By the time Leo was 25, Loom was a unicorn. By 28, he was a billionaire on paper. He moved the company headquarters to a sleek, glass-walled building in Chicago. He gave interviews about efficiency, about data-driven compassion. He was hailed as a genius who had cracked the code on urban poverty. But in his penthouse apartment, with a view of the glittering skyline, the gray blanket was now stored in a climate-controlled archival box. A relic, a paradox. He had built an empire optimizing the distribution of help, yet the most impactful help he'd ever received remained an anonymous, undata point in his past. The colder his surroundings became, the more sterile the boardrooms, the more calculated the philanthropy galas, the more he thought about the raw, unconditional exchange on that street corner. He had systematized kindness, but he missed the person. The trigger came on a Tuesday morning, 10 years and 3 months after that Christmas Eve. He was reviewing a proposed expansion into veteran homelessness services. His head of impact presented the numbers: 32,882 veterans homeless on any given night, a 7.5% decrease year over year, but still a staggering figure. One statistic was highlighted: a significant portion suffered from PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and were what they called service-resistant, avoiding traditional shelters due to trauma triggers. Leo's breath caught, a memory visceral and sharp, tired blue eyes, a calm voice asking, "You waiting for someone, soldier?" The man hadn't just been homeless. He'd carried himself with a fatigued discipline. He used the word reinforcements, the faded patch on the jacket. He stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the glass wall. "Get me everything we have on homeless veteran demographics in Columbus, Ohio, for the past decade. Cross-reference with VA benefit dispersal and shelter avoidance patterns." His team, used to his intense focus, scrambled. The data painted a picture, but it was a picture of a void. They could model likelihoods, but they couldn't find a name. Leo realized with a sinking heart that his own platform, Loom, was designed to help people who were asterisk in the system, however tenuously. The man who helped him was a ghost to the system. He had fallen through every digital net Leo had built. That's when Leo Johnson made a decision that defied all his data-driven logic. He walked out of his boardroom, down to the building's helipad, and ordered his pilot to ready the aircraft. He wasn't going to send an algorithm or a community liaison. He was going himself. He needed to physically retrace the steps. He needed to go back to the cold. The helicopter touched down in Columbus that evening. He went straight to the bus stop at Elm and 3rd. It looked smaller, less dramatic. He walked the perimeter of the small park, his designer coat seeming absurd in the familiar space. He knocked on the door of the church that still ran the soup kitchen. An elderly volunteer named Martha remembered a quiet veteran named Marcus. Sweet man, good manners, always said thank you, ma'am. He had an army jacket, disappeared one winter. Maybe 10 years back. We figured he passed or moved on. We prayed for him. Marcus, she didn't know a last name. For the next 72 hours, Leo operated with the focused intensity of a military campaign. He hired a private investigation firm with experience in locating missing persons. He used his wealth as a battering ram against bureaucratic inertia. He sat with the head of the local VA office, who, impressed and slightly intimidated by the billionaire in his lobby, agreed to personally scour records for a Marcus, who was a veteran of the 101st Airborne with PTSD and TBI annotations, who went off the grid around 10 years prior. The pieces began to snap together, forming a portrait of a life in collapse. Marcus Thorne, Sergeant, honorable discharge, a file thick with medical evaluations and benefit claims. His last known address was a P.O. box. His disability checks were still being deposited into a bank account, but they hadn't been accessed in over 9 years. The money sat there, accumulating. The system had enough information to keep paying a ghost, but not enough to find the man. The private investigators dug deeper, following the cold trail. They found a Social Security number ping in Cleveland, 3 years after he disappeared from Columbus. A hospitalization record for pneumonia and severe malnutrition. A John Doe admission that was later matched to Marcus's records. He was admitted, treated, and discharged back into the unknown. Another ping in Detroit, associated with a homeless outreach center's intake form 2 years after that. The form noted, patient exhibits signs of advanced PTSD, reluctant to engage, mentioned not wanting to be a burden. Leo's team expanded the search nationwide, using facial recognition software to scan databases of shelter intake photos, news footage of homeless encampments, even public arrest records. The digital dragnet was vast, expensive, and largely silent. Marcus Thorne was a master of obscurity, and a breakthrough from an unexpected source. One of the PIs, a former police detective, had the idea to check records from municipal cleaning operations, the periodic clearing of homeless encampments. In a report from Atlanta, Georgia, dated just 6 months earlier, there was an inventory of personal items collected from a cleared site under a downtown bridge. Listed among tarp fragments and empty cans was 1 olive drab U.S. Army field jacket, name tape, THORNE. Atlanta, he was in Atlanta, or he had been 6 months ago. Leo's helicopter was refueled and in the air within the hour. As the city lights of Atlanta sprawled below him, a new, more urgent report hit his phone. It was from the medical director of a nonprofit street medicine team that operated in Atlanta. The PI had circulated Marcus's description. The director remembered a man matching it. He treated him for a severe infected foot wound behind a library about 3 months prior. The man had refused to go to a hospital. The director's notes were chilling. Patient is a veteran, likely in his late 50s. Infection is advancing. Observed signs of possible sepsis. Cognitive awareness fading. He refused all further help, expressed a desire to be left in peace. Prognosis is grave without immediate hospitalization. The mission was no longer a search. It was a rescue, and they were almost out of time. The helicopter banked hard, its searchlights cutting through the Georgia night, not looking for a memory anymore, but for a dying man. The helicopter's searchlight swept over a city of shadows, illuminating not a man but the scale of the impossibility. Atlanta's downtown underpasses, rail corridors, and wooded pockets hid hundreds of the unhoused. From the air, Leo felt a surge of futility. He was looking for a single, dying needle in a moving, living haystack. He ordered the pilot to land at the nearest helipad. The mission went analog. He met his expanded ground team, the private investigators, 2 former combat medics he'd hired, and a local street outreach worker named Derek who knew the contours of survival on these streets. Derek looked at the billionaire in his pristine tactical gear with skepticism. He doesn't want to be found. Men like him, they've made an art of disappearing. If he's sick like you say, he's gone deeper, somewhere quiet to finish it. They started at the library where the street medic had treated Marcus's foot. The area was now empty, cleared by a city sweep just weeks before. They showed Marcus's old army photo, digitally aged, to every outreach worker, every food truck volunteer, every police officer on a beat. For hours, they got shakes of the head. Then a break. A man named Elijah who lived in a tent community by the railway recognized the description. Quiet guy, walks with a limp now, stays to himself. Called him Sarge, ain't seen him in maybe 2 weeks, said he was going up to the old mill, place is condemned, said he wanted walls that wouldn't talk back. The old Riverside textile mill was a gargantuan shell of brick and broken windows on the city's ragged edge. It was a labyrinth of darkness, hazardous floors, and the echoes of abandoned industry. As Leo's team approached, Derek held up a hand. If he's in there and he hears a crowd, he'll bolt, or worse. Leo made a decision. He sent the team to surround the building. He would go in alone with just Derek. They picked their way through a shattered loading bay door. The interior was a cathedral of decay, freezing cold, smelling of wet brick and rust. They used flashlights, calling out softly, "Marcus, Sergeant Thorne, my name is Leo. I'm not with the city, I'm here to help." Only echoes answered. They found evidence of recent habitation on the second floor in a former foreman's office with 2 walls still intact, a neat bedroll, a few canned goods, a canteen, and pinned to the wall with a rusty nail, a faded photograph of a young soldier with his squad in the desert. It was him, but the space felt abandoned, the stillness absolute. Then Derek's flashlight caught a glint in the far corner behind a collapsed loom, a pair of eyes reflecting the light. A low, pained voice, thinned by weakness but sharp with defiance, cut through the dark. "That's far enough. Turn around." Leo's heart hammered. He lowered his flashlight so the beam wasn't blinding. In the indirect light, he saw him. Marcus was propped against the brick, wrapped in a thin, filthy sleeping bag. He was gaunt, his beard matted, his face flushed with fever. But the eyes were the same tired blue, now clouded with pain and mistrust. The faded army jacket was pulled around his shoulders. "Sergeant Thorne," Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Leo Johnson. You don't know me, but you helped me once, a long time ago, at a bus stop in Columbus. You gave me your blanket." A long, silent moment. Marcus's eyes squinted, searching Leo's face, seeing no trace of the shivering 6-year-old. "Don't know what you're talking about," he rasped. "You need to leave." The blanket was gray wool. You said, hold the line until your reinforcements arrive." Leo repeated the words that had lived in his memory for a decade. Marcus's expression didn't soften, it tightened with a kind of anguished confusion, a memory unwanted resurfacing. "That was a lifetime ago. That boy is gone, I'm gone, leave me be." "The infection in your foot has spread, Marcus," Derek said gently, taking a slow step forward. "The medic saw you, it's in your blood now, that's sepsis. You'll die here in the cold. Again." "Made my peace with it," Marcus whispered, closing his eyes. Leo took a knee, ignoring the grime, getting to eye level just as Marcus had done for him a decade prior. "I didn't," Leo said, his voice breaking. "I never made my peace with you vanishing. That blanket saved me, not just from the cold. It saved me from believing no one gave a damn. It gave me something to prove that kindness isn't a waste. I built my whole life trying to prove that what you did mattered. And now I need you to let me return the favor. Please." Marcus opened his eyes. He looked at this grown man, this stranger pleading with him in a ruined mill. The will to resist, hardened over years of survival, began to crack under the sheer, illogical weight of this reappearance. A tear traced a path through the dirt on his cheek. He gave the barest, almost imperceptible nod. It took 20 minutes to carefully extract him, to carry him down the unstable stairs on a litter. As they emerged into the night, Marcus, bundled and shivering, looked up at the waiting helicopter, its rotor blades beginning to spin. A flicker of old discipline surfaced. "Civilian bird," he muttered. "It's ours," Leo said. "We're going to the best hospital in the state." The flight was a blur of controlled urgency. Marcus slipped in and out of consciousness. At the hospital, a medical team was waiting on the roof. He was rushed into the ER. The diagnosis was severe. Advanced sepsis originating from the neglected foot wound, compounded by pneumonia, severe malnutrition, and the relentless toll of a decade of exposure. He was admitted to the ICU, intubated and placed in a medically induced coma to let his body fight. The doctors were blunt with Leo. "His body is exhausted. The next 24 to 48 hours are critical. We're treating him, but his will to live will be the deciding factor." Leo stood in the sterile, quiet hallway, looking through the glass at the broken man in the bed. The hero of his childhood was a collection of tubes and monitors. He had found him, but he might have only found him in time to say goodbye. Then a new complication arose. The hospital administration, while providing care, needed to navigate the realities of a John Doe patient with no insurance. Leo immediately guaranteed all expenses, but a social worker also began the process of identifying next of kin. They accessed Marcus's VA file, which listed an emergency contact, a sister, Eleanor Thorne Wallace, in Dayton, Ohio. She had not been contacted by the VA in over 8 years. The file noted, "Sister reports estrangement. Patient isolated self after last visit in 2013. Leo called her himself. The woman who answered sounded wary. When he explained who he was and that her brother was critically ill in an Atlanta ICU, there was a long, heavy silence. Then not sadness, but a simmering anger. Marcus made his choices. He pushed everyone away. After our parents died, he came back from the war a ghost. We tried. God knows we tried. He wouldn't stay on his meds, he'd disappear for months. He said he was a burden. The last time I saw him, he told me to live my life and forget about him, so I tried." She paused. I'll come down, not for him, to see what's what." Eleanor arrived the next day, a stern, neatly dressed woman in her 60s. Her confrontation with Leo in the waiting room was brutal. "What is this? Some billionaire's guilt project? You found him playing hero and now you get to have your feel-good story," she challenged, her voice tight with years of frustrated love. "He saved me," Leo said simply, refusing to be baited. "When no one else did, I'm just trying to keep him alive." "You don't know him," Eleanor shot back, but the fight was leaving her as she glanced toward the ICU. The sight of her brother, so diminished, finally broke through her defenses. She slumped into a chair. "He was the best of us, charismatic, strong, protective. The war, it didn't kill him, it just erased him slowly, and we had to watch, powerless." She agreed to sign the necessary medical consent forms, reestablishing the familial link the system required. For 3 days, Marcus hovered between life and death. Leo rarely left the hospital. He reviewed Loom business remotely, but his focus was on the vital signs monitor. He talked to the unconscious man, telling him about the company, about the blanket in its archival box, about the cold bus stop. He played music from the early 2000s, the era when Marcus would have been whole. On the 4th morning, the doctors began to slowly reduce the sedatives. It was a careful, risky process. Later that afternoon, Marcus's fingers twitched. Then his eyes, cloudy and disoriented, fluttered open. He was weak, confused, tethered to the world by wires and tubes. But he was alive. His first coherent word, whispered through cracked lips to the nurse, was "where?" The nurse calmly explained he was in a hospital in Atlanta, that he'd been very sick, that he was safe. Marcus's eyes drifted around the room, landing on Leo, who stood nervously by the door. Recognition, slow and painful, dawned. Not of the billionaire, but of the man from the mill, the one who spoke of a blanket. Leo approached. "Hey, Sergeant," he said softly. Marcus studied him for a long time. The defiance was gone, burned away by fever and exhaustion. What remained was a profound, weary vulnerability. His gaze dropped to his own hands on the sheet, then back to Leo. He gave that same, slow, firm nod he'd given a small boy a decade before. It wasn't thanks. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a silent report, "I'm still here." The crisis had passed, but a far more complicated battle was just beginning. The road back from the brink would be measured not in hours, but in months. It would require navigating the very systems of healthcare, veterans' benefits, and trauma recovery that Marcus had spent a lifetime avoiding. Leo had pulled him from the shadows. Now they had to walk together into the painful light. Recovery is not a single event, but a daily negotiation between the person you were and the person you must become. For Marcus Thorne, waking up was just the first step into a new, bewildering war. The enemy was his own body, his traumatized mind, and a world he had deliberately withdrawn from a decade before. The hospital was a cage of beeps and fluorescent lights, triggering memories of military hospitals. The first week out of the ICU was a haze of pain medication and panic attacks. He would wake up disoriented, convinced he was back in the mill, or worse, in a desert outpost. The nurses were trained in trauma-informed care, but it was Leo who found the key. He brought the archival box to the hospital. He opened it at Marcus's bedside, revealing the folded gray blanket. The wool was clean now, but its texture was unmistakable. Marcus stared at it, his breathing slowing. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the fabric. A single, silent tear fell. He didn't speak, but he nodded again, a deeper, more profound acknowledgement. The blanket stayed on his bed after that, a tangible anchor to a moment when he was still someone who could give, not just receive. Physical rehabilitation was grueling. He had to relearn how to walk, the septic infection having damaged nerves and muscle in his leg. A physical therapist worked with him daily, a battle of inches and agonizing effort. Leo was there for many of the sessions, not helping, just witnessing. His presence was a quiet reminder, you are not doing this alone. Meanwhile, Leo's team of experts went to work on the bureaucratic front. They partnered with a veterans service organization to untangle Marcus, VA benefits. They discovered that his monthly disability payments, untouched for nearly a decade, had accumulated in his account to a sum of over $86,000. The system had been paying a ghost, and the ghost now had a small fortune waiting for him. More importantly, they secured his placement in a specialized, long-term residential treatment program for veterans with complex PTSD and traumatic brain injury. A place with private rooms, extensive therapy, and a focus on reintegration. Alina, his sister, stayed for 2 weeks. The first meetings were stiff, freighted with a decade of hurt. But in the quiet of the hospital room with Marcus too weak to run, old bonds began to repair. She told him about her kids, his nieces and nephews he'd never met. She showed him pictures on her phone. He listened, his eyes wet. One afternoon, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Ellie." It was the first time he'd used her childhood nickname in 15 years. She took his hand and held it, and didn't let go for a long time. After 6 weeks, Marcus was discharged from the acute hospital and transferred directly to the residential treatment facility in the rolling hills of northern Georgia. It was a world away from the concrete underpass. He had a room with a window that looked out on trees. His days were structured with therapy, cognitive processing therapy for his PTSD, counseling for his trauma, physical therapy for his leg. For the first month, he barely spoke in group sessions. He was the oldest resident by a decade, and he felt like a relic. Leo visited every weekend without fail. He didn't talk business. They would sit on a bench, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about nothing, the birds, the weather, a book Marcus was trying to read. Leo was patient. He was building trust the way one builds a bridge, one careful plank at a time. He also brought a proposal. He wanted Marcus's help. "My company, Loom," Leo explained one crisp autumn day. "We map resources for people in crisis, but we're missing a huge piece. We're missing the people who avoid the system altogether, the ones like you. I have data scientists and software engineers. What I don't have is a strategist who understands the terrain of disappearance. I want you to consult for us, when you're ready." Marcus was skeptical. "I'm not a tech guy. I can barely use a phone." "You don't need to be," Leo said. "You need to tell us where the maps are wrong. You need to help us see the blind spots. You're the expert in a field no one wants to be an expert in." It was a lifeline, not of charity, but of purpose. Marcus began to engage more in his own therapy, seeing it as necessary training for a new mission. He started making notes in a journal, observations about shelter design that triggered anxiety, ideas for low-contact outreach, the psychological barriers to accepting help. He was, for the first time in years, planning for a future. After 4 months in the program, Marcus was granted a weekend pass. Leo flew down and picked him up. They didn't go to a fancy restaurant or a penthouse. Leo drove them to a small, quiet cabin he'd rented by a lake. He had one item with him, the gray blanket. That evening, by a crackling fire, Leo told Marcus the full story of his life after that night: the struggles, the coding, the scholarship, the rise of Loom. He talked about the cold that never left him, and how the blanket was his reminder that connection was possible. Marcus listened, staring into the flames. When Leo finished, Marcus spoke, his voice low and rough. "I thought I was just giving a kid a blanket. I thought it was the last decent thing I'd ever do." He paused. "I was wrong. It was the first decent thing I'd done in a long time, and it's the reason I'm sitting here now." That night, for the first time, Marcus Thorne smiled. A real, unguarded smile. The transformation was slow, but it was real. After 8 months, Marcus graduated from the residential program. He moved into a small, stable apartment in a veterans community in Atlanta, funded by his own back benefits and a modest salary from his consulting role at Loom. He worked remotely, meeting weekly with Leo's product team. His insights led to concrete changes: the development of a low-signature mode for the Loom app that didn't require persistent location tracking, partnerships with veteran-led peer outreach groups instead of large institutions, a redesign of shelter intake forms to reduce triggers. He wasn't a billionaire, but he was a respected specialist. He had a title: Director of Veteran Engagement. Leo, in turn, was changed. The frantic, data-obsessed edge to his leadership softened. He redirected a significant portion of Loom's profits to fund a new initiative called the Thorne Fellowship, which provided grants and support to veterans developing solutions to homelessness and PTSD. The story of the blanket and the billionaire leaked to the press, but Leo refused to make it a publicity stunt. He gave one interview, alongside Marcus, in which he said, "This isn't a rags-to-riches story. It's a story about visibility. Marcus saw me when I was invisible. I was just returning the gaze." The final surprise came on the 1-year anniversary of the rescue. Leo organized a small gathering at the cabin by the lake. Alina was there with her family. Marcus's nieces and nephews, now teenagers, hugged the uncle they'd only known through stories. As they sat around the fire, Leo presented Marcus with a gift. It wasn't the blanket. That had already been returned to Marcus months before, now folded on his own bed. It was a framed document. It was the original incident report from the Columbus Church soup kitchen, noting Marcus's disappearance a decade prior. Next to it, a recent letter from the same church expressing joy at his recovery. And in the center, a simple handwritten note from Leo. It read, "Account settled, friendship ongoing." It was Leo's way of closing the ledger, of moving them from debtor and creditor to what they now were: family. Marcus looked at it, then at the faces around the fire: his sister, her children, and the man who had crossed a decade and a fortune to find him. His eyes shone in the firelight. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," he said, his voice thick. "You gave a blanket to a kid," Leo said, smiling. "That's all." That night, under a sky full of stars, the cold that had defined both their lives felt finally, truly gone. The helicopter had found its target, but the real journey was the one that began after the rotors stopped spinning. A slow, steady walk out of the darkness, side by side. The story of Marcus and Leo feels like a modern fable, but its power lies in the hard, quiet truths it reveals about our world and ourselves. It's a story about two forms of invisibility: the kind forced upon a veteran by trauma and a broken system, and the kind felt by a child lost in the chaos of poverty. Their connection, lasting less than a minute, became a lifeline that stretched across a decade because it was built on a fundamental human truth: to be seen is to be saved. We live in an age of unprecedented connection, yet isolation has never been more acute. We have algorithms that can predict our desires, but we are losing the skill of noticing the person right in front of us who is silently drowning. Marcus Thorne's story is not unique. There are thousands of Marcuses, their uniforms traded for sleeping bags, their battles now fought in the shadows of our cities. And for every one of them, there are 1,000 small, silent opportunities to intervene. A glance held a moment longer, a question asked, a blanket offered. Leo Johnson's extraordinary quest is not a prescription. We cannot all send helicopters, but it is a powerful metaphor for the intentionality required to bridge the divides we have built. He had to stop seeing homelessness as a data set and remember it as a person. He had to use every tool at his disposal not for profit, but for restoration. Their story challenges a dangerous modern assumption that systemic problems are too vast for individual action, and that individual action is too small to affect systemic change. They prove that both are true at once, and that is where hope actually lives. The gray blanket was just wool. The helicopter was just machinery. The money was just a tool. The miracle was not in the objects, but in the unwavering decision made twice across 10 years to see another human being not as a problem, but as a person. To choose connection over indifference. That is a currency available to every single one of us, every single day. If this story reminded you of the transformative power of a single act of kindness, then share that reminder. Tap the like button to spread this message. Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that explore the depth of the human spirit. We are here to remind you that in a world often focused on the spectacular, the most profound revolutions begin with a simple, deliberate choice: to see, to stay, and to help. Tell us in the comments, when has a small act of kindness, given or received, changed the course of your story? We read every one. Thank you for watching. May you have the courage to offer your blanket and the grace to accept one when you are cold. Until next time.